This is the second in a series of training bytes covering the control and customization of UVM reports. If you haven't already, we recommend you take the basics training byte first. That talks about the terminology and the functionality for reports and gives you some useful tips on message defines and basic guidelines. But in this training byte, we're going to have a look at verbosity control, specifically methods and command line options for controlling verbosity, which allows you to set up different zones of verbosity inside of your UVM environment. So the issues we're trying to address here, for example, you may have a UVC in your environment that generates hundreds of reports. You want to filter those down a bit. Perhaps you only want to see reports coming out of a certain part of your UVM hierarchy from a certain UVC in a test class, and perhaps you just want to run your simulation with different verbosity settings for different parts of a UVM hierarchy. And we're going to show you how to do this in this training byte. First of all of your UVM output should be under verbosity control, which means you should never make calls to $display or print directly inside of your UVM environment. Now there's some UVM output, particularly debug output, which is not verbosity controlled by default, typically topology print or factory print. So here I have a print topology in my end of elaboration phase, which will always be printed. If I want to bring this under verbosity control, I can do that with a method UVM report enabled. This has three arguments: a verbosity setting, a severity, and an ID, and typically we just use the verbosity argument. Now this method will return a 1 if the verbosity maximum of the current component is greater or equal to the verbosity argument. So I can just check the return value of report enabled before I call print topology. If the current verbosity setting is medium or higher, I will call print topology, otherwise I won't. So effectively I've put a UVM medium verbosity on my print topology call. I can also use the severity and the ID arguments to pick up reports of a certain severity or with a certain ID, as we'll show later. Now we're going to be showing you both code and command line options for controlling verbosity, and these behave in different ways, so we need to be clear about their functionality before we try to use them. So first of all, code options make calls to UVM methods. These can be applied to a particular component in your UVM hierarchy using a path name. So to control these, we make the calls in test classes, and these allow us to enable or disable the settings by swapping out different tests for a simulation run. Now when you apply these settings hierarchically, they conform to a last one in wins. What this means, if we need a different verbosity setting for the TB and the UVC1 levels of the hierarchy, you need to set everything below TB first and then set the verbosity for UVC1 to overwrite the setting applied to the TB hierarchy. The other option is to use command line options. These take precedence over your code settings because they're written into the UVM environment at the topmost level, UVM_root. The nice thing about these is they're dynamic. You can change them for each simulation run without having to recompile your environment. We can put these in the run file, makes them easier to use. It means you don't have to remember to type them out in full each time. But when you apply these to different parts of the hierarchy, these conform to a first match methodology. What this means is once you've set a component using a command line setting, it's locked, and further writes to the same hierarchy will not be applied. So what this means, if we need a different setting for the UVC1 than the TB, we need to set UVC1 first, and then we can set everything below TB second, because we've already set UVC1 for the command line options. The first match wins. So it's exactly the opposite way of calling them from the code arguments. So again, we need to be careful to when we apply these to make sure we understand what the precedence is for the settings. So let's have a look at the in-code verbosity control first. Again, this is done with method calls. There's 3 method calls and they're listed here in order of precedence from low to high. We can simply set the verbosity maximum for a component or component hierarchy with report verbosity level. We can set the verbosity for reports with a certain ID using report ID verbosity, or we can set the verbosity setting for reports with a certain severity and ID pair using severity ID verbosity call. Now these method calls come in two forms. They come in a non-hierarchical form, so they affect just the selected component to which they're applied, and they also come in a hierarchical form, which affects everything underneath the selected component. And the difference is in the end of the method name. So hierarchical forms have the underscore HIER at the end of the method. The non-hierarchical forms don't have the underscore HIER. So again, these methods can be called using a path name, so we can add these into our test classes to control them by swapping them in and out using different test calls. So here in my end of elaboration phase, I'm constructing a path name down through presumably the test bench into the YAP UVC, and I'm setting the verbosity level of the YAP and everything below it to UVM underscore none. So again, good tip. Put this code control in your test classes. You can then control them, enable or disable them by swapping out different tests. So the other option is to use command line verbosity control. So these are options that we put in on the command line, and we apply these to our XRun simulator call. So there's two options here. We can change the verbosity in a particular phase, or we can change the verbosity at a particular time or for a particular time period. So both options have a comp argument that allows us to build a path name down to the component hierarchy we want to affect. We have an ID argument to pick up reports with a certain ID, and then we can select the phase or the time or time period to apply the verbosity setting. Now these overwrite the default verbosity you get from the global command line option plus UVM underscore verbosity. Now for the ID argument, we can use the special string underscore all underscore, where the all is uppercase, and this can be used to apply the verbosity setting to all report IDs. Remember also, if you have multiple command line settings, only the first match applies. So you should set the lower levels of the hierarchy first, for example the UVCs, before you globally set their higher levels of hierarchy, such as test benches. So here's an example. Here we want to set the verbosity in the HBus hierarchy, which looks like it's a UVC underneath our TB block here. We want to set the verbosity to UVM underscore none for all report IDs in the run phase only. A few things to note about this. When you specify the phase, you can't have the underscore phase at the end of the name. It's just the first part of the phase name. Also here we've used that special argument minus underscore all underscore, which matches any ID. Lastly, a good tip is to put this command line control in a run file. So we put this in this file run.f, which will then call on the command line using the xrun option -f run.f. Two reasons for doing this. Firstly, you don't have to remember to type it out in full each time, and secondly, if you have wildcards in the path name, then if you typed that directly on the command line, you may need to hide those wildcards from the command interpreter by quoting the entire argument string. So it's actually easier to use to put them in a run.f file and call them from there. So let's look at an example of applying all these options. So here's my UVM hierarchy, and I have a suspected problem in UVC3. Therefore, I want to run a simulation where I have different verbosity settings for different parts of the hierarchy. What I need is a verbosity UVM underscore medium in my test class, so I can see messages and reports about which test I'm running and also the progression of that test. So I'm going to use a global plus UVM underscore verbosity command line setting to set the entire verbosity of the entire hierarchy to UVM underscore medium. Then for my test bench and below, I want to have a lower verbosity to hide the messages from these. So I'm going to use a method call, a code option here from my test class. I'll build a path name down to the TB hierarchy, and I'll set everything below the TB hierarchy to have a verbosity of UVM underscore none. And then finally, for my UVC part of the hierarchy, I want to have a UVM underscore high verbosity, so I see as many messages as possible from inside that hierarchy, and I'll do this with a command line option plus UVM set verbosity, build a path name down to the UVC3 part of the hierarchy, use the underscore all underscore to pick up all report IDs, and set the verbosity to UVM underscore high for the run phase. So hey, as you can see, using all these settings, we can then run a UVM simulation that has different verbosity maximums in different parts of the hierarchy, allowing you to concentrate on those parts of the hierarchy where you think there may be a problem. So that was a quick look at verbosity control in UVM. The next byte in this series will have a look at severity control. So we'll have a look at methods and command line options for controlling and changing the severity of messages. Other bytes in this series will have a look at action control, file locking, and customization with catchers and servers.